Dr. Derron Coles is a learning strategist with over 20 years of designing learner-focused workforce training. He has a wide-ranging portfolio running the gambit from global online training on river systems analysis to interpersonal skills training, including award-winning equity, diversity, and inclusion EDI curriculum. Derron has earned certificates in e-learning design, the Theismann method of collaborative learning, and the Oregon Department of Public Safety Standards and Training. Upon completion of his bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering at the University of Maryland, Derron moved to Oregon to complete his master's and doctorate in civil engineering at Oregon State University. He spent 8 years managing the mathematics program for the OSU Educational Opportunities Program. In his role, Derron led recruiting and retention of underrepresented science and engineering students. Derron is now the owner and principal consultant of DRC Learning Solutions, a culturally responsive company focused on private and public sector social and environmental justice initiatives. As a Lean Six Sigma Black Belt, Derron brings a process of oriented and learning-based approach to his projects. His portfolio includes projects for small nonprofits, such as Water Watch, for large organizations like the U.S. Forest Service, and for multi-organization collaboratives like the Interwine Alliance EDI cohorts. Derron is also the executive director of the Blueprint Foundation. This is a nonprofit trains Black identified students using project-based learning and multi-generational mentoring. It centers on pressing environmental justice issues while solidifying skills for college careers in green sector and for civil life. Please welcome Derron Coles. And I'll just say thank you for, and I'm gonna hand it over to Derron, and then afterwards we can take questions that Willow will lead, and I'll be watching the chat.
Great. Thanks, Dane. So, hi, everybody. Let me minimize this. Let's see my slides easily. It's nice to be with you today. What I'd like to talk to you about, and actually, let me start off by saying from an instructional design standpoint, I usually like to do 10-minute to 15-minute chunks of lecturing and then have engagement from the audience. We aren't doing that tonight. I just feel the need to let you know that I am aware of best practices. I just have a different setup tonight. And what we're gonna, or what I'm going to discuss is here in the agenda. So working on it, this module, I'll give a bit more background of me, and I'll talk a little bit about workforce development and how that helps create these ecosystems that are biodiverse. I'll talk about blueprint programming. I'll run through all of our programming, but I'll try and hone in on the middle and high school programming, which is related to a project that we have out at Leash Botanical Garden. And I've got lots of slides of images of that project to share with you. But before I do, we're going to do insights from the past. There's research that's been done here in Portland, and the research was around asking predominantly white organizations what the barriers are to community partnerships with BIPOC organization, that's Black, Indigenous, People of Color orgs. And then they also asked BIPOC organizations what are the barriers to working with predominantly white orgs? And so I'll present a little bit of that research just to talk about sort of the challenges of these community partnerships before talking about the Back Five, a partnership where we made sure that it was inclusive using strategies from EDI work. So first, me. So I grew up in Baltimore. You mentioned I went to University of Maryland, Baltimore County for my undergrad in mechanical engineering. It was a lot of lab work in windowless rooms. And so as was said, I switched to civil engineering with the water resources focus. That started in undergrad, really. I was in a scholars program, and we had to do an undergraduate research project, and I just could not find a mechanical engineering project because I was so focused on the environment and helping the Chesapeake Bay, which at the time was going through hysteria. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with that, but essentially algal blooms that were killing fish and making people sick. And so I wanted to study that, and that was sort of my entryway into the work that I currently do. When I got to undergrad, I noticed that I was often the only Black person in my classes. And when I started doing environmental work, it seemed that the same was true in the green sector. And so I thought, I do want to be out at the river. I do want to do this work, but I also need to figure out a way to make sure that it's sort of all hands on deck on meeting these environmental challenges, because if we don't have everybody working on it in parallel, we really can't get this done. And so that's why I do what I do. That's why I'm here tonight. And that's why I'm working on it. And the way I work on this is through workforce development, my work with the Blueprint Foundation. So I'll talk a bit about the Blueprint Foundation, but first I just wanted to mention what the role is of workforce development and why we do what we do at Blueprint. We feel that if we are going to do things like make our spaces more biodiverse, remove non-native plants, and have healthier ecosystems, we need folks advocating for that. We need people on the ground checking and making sure that we're going in the right direction, collecting data, right? Making sure that if we're planting things, if we're planting trees, there's someone going back and making sure disease doesn't take over, making sure that the plants are being cared for so that they can get established. And we need folks doing that as their career. And there are, like I said earlier, there's an underrepresentation of folks that look like me in the sector. So we wanted to make sure we weren't just adding practitioners to existing organizations, but that we were also creating new organizations that are BIPOC-led, and that brings social economic development to BIPOC communities. So that's the role of workforce development, and that's why Blueprint went from a mentoring organization to a workforce development organization. And so we contribute. We take Black youth and adults out, and they are training on the job, right? So they're out there planting, they're out there monitoring. I'll talk about the program, so I won't go too much into it here, but these are the basic buckets: planting, monitoring, maintaining these green spaces, and advocating for new green spaces, particularly in areas where there's a history of disinvestment, a history of industrializing some neighborhoods. And typically those neighborhoods are neighborhoods where my students live, Black and brown neighborhoods that sometimes get gentrified or often get gentrified, and pushes folks out to new industrialized neighborhoods that also need care. So how do we switch the script here? Through workforce development. And when we do it, if we do it right, if we do it equitably, if we include all the key people, that means community members, that means government, and that means industry in the mix, then we see the results. We see relationships between community and government improving despite the baggage, the trauma from the past. We see more community input which brings informed decision-making from folks that are witnessing these things on the ground, right? Contributing to the decision-making so that we create solutions that are more innovative and more likely to work because everyone feels ownership of them. We end up with more diversity in urban forestry, right? And business owners, as I mentioned before. And it's community members stewarding their own spaces, right? So I love it when our students walk down the street with their family members, with their friends, and point to our projects, point to trees they planted, point to areas where they started out with Blackberry, and now these are biodiverse spaces, and telling their family members about what they did and why it's important. Shifting the narrative, right? Letting folks know how important this stuff is and why we should all be stewarding these spaces. And if we do that, if they do that, then we end up with more green spaces, right, in these critical areas. And the students that make a career out of it see the social economic growth, right? And ultimately, when we have everybody, community, government, and industry involved, we have that informed decision-making to come up with interventions that are likely to work. And we have the capacity to actually implement these things. So those are results. So that's workforce development. Let's talk about Blueprint programs. We do cradle to career. Okay. So we try to get students early, and we do that through Engineering Promise. What we do with Engineering Promise is we work with childcare providers that work with Black early learners, and we co-created these engineering design challenges that are nature-based. And the idea is families, parents, would facilitate these challenges with their early learners to help to develop engineering design skills before kindergarten. One issue that we have that we face at Blueprint is tracking in our formal education system, where the bias is that Black youth can't do math, aren't interested in science, and couldn't be farther from the truth. Right? And so what we're doing with Black parents and early learners is getting them a head start, making their parents their first educator again, teaching their parents how to advocate for their youth and how to help out the formal education system so that their youth do not get tracked. The activities that they do are Afrocentric. For example, I'll give one example, and it is a nest activity. And so the family members read two books, two picture books to their early learners. One is on basket weaving from African tradition, and another is on bird nests. And the challenge is for families to go out into nature, act like birds, collect materials to create a nest, and use some materials that we give them to create a nest, but to do so with African designs in it. Right? And so it really forces parents to get engaged and not just hand a toy to the child and let them go, but actually facilitate and take part in it and go out in nature and experience these spaces together. Right? Reconnecting parents to the education of their kids, reconnecting families to nature. That's Engineering Promise. And then there's our middle and high school programming. Grounding Waters and Constructing Careers is all about environmental science and green building, green infrastructure. Green infrastructure meaning things like bioswales, rain gardens, building compost bins, right? They do that sort of thing. And we do this using a model that I developed at Oregon State University for identity development. And so the model is intended to help students gain a positive sense of their cultural identity while also developing a STEM identity. Right? So really integrating their culture with their interest in science and interest in the environment. And we do that through what's called the WISE model of development. And WISE stands for, first, witness. So we take students out, we take them out to see things that they haven't seen before. Every time we go out to the coast with a new group of students, there's at least one student that says, this is my first time being at the coast. Every time we take students to Silver Falls, this is my first time seeing a waterfall in person, right? And we snap pictures with them and that they can share with their families. And the idea is to let them see these spaces, let them experience it in affinity with other Black people. Quite often, Black people, well, I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I don't feel safe going out alone in nature, not because of nature, but because of other people. And so we take students out in groups so that they can let go of all of the stressors, practice mindfulness, look around. We have them look for plants. And we ask them to start naming the plants. Right? What do you think this one is called? Do you think this is native or non-native? What are the signs that a plant is invasive? Right? Use all of your senses. Which plants here seem like this is the space where they always belonged? Which plants seem to be struggling? Right? And we make analogies to their lives, just as my mother did when I was younger. She would point to weeds in the sidewalk, like Queen Anne's lace, growing out of a crack. And she would say things like, you know, Black people are just like these plants. We don't have a lot of resources sometimes because of life circumstances, but we still survive. Right? And so, I'm sorry, I get emotional sometimes. And so we go through these activities with our youth to reconnect them. And then we investigate issues. So now they've seen these beautiful spaces. They've learned that some of these plants are forcing other plants out, are making spaces more homogeneous. And we talk about water quality and air quality and how the work that folks do in restoration impacts these things. And we get them to investigate, to look at keystone species, right? Like the student is doing here, looking at macroinvertebrates, right? Investigating those issues before we solve them. And so we say, everyone can contribute. Let's find your favorite way to do so. And so we have some students that really love being out in nature and doing the restoration activities. And it helps, right? And they're learning. And then we have other students that want to work in the built environment. So that's why we have grounding waters and constructing careers. Because it's okay if students' jam isn't being out in nature, they can still contribute to climate resilience. They can still help their neighbors, their family members with energy costs, making their homes more energy efficient, like the students on the right are doing. And then we don't stop there. We say, okay, you've learned all this stuff, you've done these projects, you know what the impact can be for doing these projects, let's spread the word. And so we want all of our students to have at least one moment where they're educating others. And so we train them. The students here were trained to lead field trips for K-8 schools. And so they talk about macroinvertebrates. They use these activities that you see them showing to talk about riparian zones, to talk about biodiversity, right? and they're in the driver's seat, right? They're the educators. So very young kids get to see Black students taking the lead, being environmentalists, which again changes the narrative of who does this work, right? And again, we don't stop there. We want our students to see themselves as professionals. And so we pay them as professionals, right? We've got internship programs where if they're into building science, like the students in this program, then they get the chance to do that energy efficiency work. Let's say students are interested in technology and interested in programming. There's also a place in the green sector for these folks because we need data. We need to know what our baseline is. We need to know if we're doing these interventions, are they working or not? And so in our Changes in the Air program, we work with engineers and scientists to develop technical skill training and social cultural training for advocacy and policy work. And then we train Black youth along with Black college students that are in electrical engineering, computer science or related majors. We train them in how to do air quality studies, how to build air quality sensors, how to program the sensors so that they can pull data. We built a database where we can put all the sensor data in the database for the community members to see. And then we build sensors together. We buy some more high-tech sensors as well, and we put them out in the community. And we make the data accessible to community members. And thus far, we've gotten not just community interest, but governmental interest. So right now, one of our students, for example, is working for Multnomah County. Multnomah County has a wood stove change-out program, and they want to know if it's working or not. And so they're paying our student to pull air quality data, analyze it, and tell them what the baseline is, and then track changes as they switch out these wood stoves for heat pumps. For students that really enjoyed it, oh, I see a chat. Oh, great. For the students that really enjoyed the educational piece, we've got Tap and Roots. And it is training for environmental educators. And so we do lots of activities that you would do if you were in, say, an education program at a university, right? So we sort of build their muscle. We get them to start talking using scientific language, as well as describing things using, we say, now say it in your own words. Say it as though you were explaining it to your little cousin. Okay, now you're talking to a professor. So how would you explain it to this person? And just get them used to code switching, used to using scientific language when it's necessary, and recognizing when using scientific language is exclusionary, right? Making sure that we have Black educators out there interpreting data and, again, changing the narrative, right? On who does this work, who has this knowledge, who has this expertise. And they do it in cohort. Because I will admit, it is not easy being a Black person in STEM. And so it's really helpful to know other Black folks that have similar interests. My first environmental science, this is a quick aside, my first environmental science class, I got an A, not just because I aced the tests, but my teacher let everyone in the class know that Derron is getting an A because he was the only one that got into the river when we did our field trips. I was the only one that was willing to take that step. And now we have dozens of students that are taking that step into the river, into nature. And we also have programming for adult learners that we do in partnership with other folks. Right? Blueprint's a small organization, so we don't have a lot of capacity. But like I said, when we do this right, we can get it done. And doing it right means partnering with organizations that typically don't work with organizations of color. And there's lots of issues that come along with trying to do these diverse partnerships. And I'll talk about that in a moment of what we do to get past that stuff. But the Green Workforce Academy is one program that we do in partnership with other orgs. And we train BIPOC folks in a variety of, I guess, it's parts of the sector. So farming, restoration, silviculture. They get to do things that they could do as their career. And then we connect them with the folks that hire people that are interested in the line of work that they're interested in. So it's training them and then getting them into entry-level work or additional training programs. We also have an urban forestry initiative that we do in partnership with lots of other organizations. And that's all about changing how we green spaces in this region, right? Where investments go, making sure that policies help rather than hinder. Right? So things like linking contracts for doing this work to workforce development. So industry or company A, you get this contract if a portion of your work is done with trainees from a local workforce development program, right? Connecting Canopies also has a community engagement task force where we collect community data to know where we should be focusing our work. We have a data task force where we work with folks at the Nature Conservancy and PSU on maps that have tree canopy layers and environmental justice layers so that we can identify spots in the city where, for example, the heat island effect is an issue, and we do our work there. Spaces where there's a natural area that isn't cared for, and so we do our training there. So that as we're training folks up, we're also sort of moving the needle on restoring the spaces around us. Connecting Canopies works because we started with community. Ask community what they were interested in. Ask them what sorts of jobs they would like to have related to the environment. Ask them what their experience is of green spaces around them, right? And then we talked to industry professionals and got them on board and said, hey, we have this program. We're going to do policy advocacy. We're going to do workforce development. And by the way, you said that you wanted to diversify your company. This is a perfect way to do that as well. And then we went to government and said the same thing. You have equity goals. You have environmental justice goals. Right? You want to green spaces and in the city so that Portland remains one of those places that people talk about when someone mentions a green city. So join us. Right? And with that intersectional expertise, that cultural knowledge, the on-the-ground knowledge, the knowledge about how you technically do these things, and then the folks that hold the purse strings, the folks that can create laws around this to solidify this new way of greening spaces, all in the same room, talking about how we can do this, and then actually taking action. right? So actually putting together a pre-apprenticeship program for urban forestry where cohorts of BIPOC and low-income folks learn the whole suite of things that they could do in urban forestry. And then at the end of 9 months, they get to say which area they cared most about, which area really excited them. And then we connect them with one of our industry partners for an internship. And the idea is, it's not just an internship, it's a job interview. Because we, like I said, these folks are hoping to diversify their companies. And so they get the chance to spend time with someone or folks that they can then hire. And it's happened. We've got graduates working at Portland Parks and Rec. We've got graduates working at Portland Fruit Tree Project. So it's working. It's working, but it takes a lot. It takes a village, right? It takes a lot of folks helping out. So Blueprint, Urban Green Spaces Institute, and the Nature Conservancy really sort of started the ball rolling, but lots of other orgs jumped in to help. And some of them jumped in to help with the training. So we have restoration orgs, right? We have arboricultural orgs, folks that work primarily with fruit trees, folks that work primarily with large form trees, folks like Meadow Sweet Gardens that works primarily with ornamentals and native plants, all teaching our trainees, our interns about plant ID and about restoration practices. Okay. When do you plant which things? Which things do we need to make sure do not take over? All that sort of stuff. I feel like, oh no, we're good. So let's talk some insights from the past. This is the section where we're going to talk about the research that was done with predominantly white and predominantly BIPOC organizations. So we want to do these partnerships, but there are barriers. And they're not barriers that we erected. There's systems that we're operating within that impacts our ability to connect with each other, form these partnerships, and actually see these things through. And so they asked folks, well, what are the barriers? And folks said, well, racism and other isms that come into play and causes cultural conflicts, causes microaggressions, breaks down relationships. And they said that there's a lack of understanding about intersectionality, how the systems of oppression are intertwined with the environmental challenges that we have. And so we have to have conversations about this. We have to work through and understand how we're only more sustainable if we break down these oppressive systems, thereby freeing up people to be fully engaged in the effort. Working on environmental justice, working on racial justice issues gives people agency to contribute, makes them an equal partner. And so the coalitions that Blueprint is in, that's our focus. Making sure that everyone is an equal partner, making sure that we're as inclusive as possible and as intentional as possible, because we know what systems we're operating under. We know sexism and misogyny can come into play quite easily. when we aren't being intentional. Because if you're talking neuroscience, we all have limbic regions. We have neocortex, right? The part of our brain where we can do our abstract thinking, where we can empathize with other people, where we can question our own assumptions. But we also have a limbic region. Especially when we get stressed, we rely on that limbic region. And that's where all of the messages we've learned about who does this work, who cares about this work, how good of a worker is this group over that group. Right? All those messages, all those stereotypes are in our limbic region, just waiting to be activated, waiting for us to not be intentional, waiting for us to be stressed out, waiting for us not to know what to say, so we blurt the first thing out that we're thinking, not realizing that the language that we're using is language that we learned that's problematic, right? Because we all have blind spots. And it breaks relationships down. So how do we prevent that from happening? How are we allowing ourselves to be vulnerable when we make mistakes? And say, hey, I'm sorry, I was moving fast, or I was stressed out and I said something, and I actually, now that I'm thinking about what I said, these are the ways that I think it's problematic, and I apologize. That simple thing is how we keep our coalitions together. We know we're going to make mistakes because we're human. Right? And so we need to make sure, if we want to have coalitions last, we need to make sure that we're willing to be vulnerable. Willing to do what my director at EOP used to say, one of our staff members, we always talked about this stuff at work back at OSU. And one staff member in particular was she was old school, and she was more prone to making mistakes than other folks. And so instead of getting upset or allowing relationships to break down, my director would say, oh, here comes, that's the foot and mouth syndrome again, right? Just to sort of break the tension and allow us to be vulnerable. So how are we vulnerable with the folks that we're trying to build relationships with? If we can't get there, at some point, a mistake will happen that degrades the relationship. This is linked to the systems, the bias, and the segregation. We say that segregation is ended, but that is not the case. I do a lot of equity training, and when someone says, oh, there's no segregation anymore, then I have a little activity that I do. And I think this is a common activity in equity training. I only break it out in these moments. So if someone says, segregation was over years ago, I say, okay, well, let's take out paper, and I'm going to list a few things, and then you write the initials of the person that you would trust to do that thing. And we start naming things. Watching my kids, okay? Watching my house, giving money advice, like financial advice. And I run through a list of things. And once we're done, I say, okay, now put the racial background of all of the folks you initialed on your paper. And then we have a discussion. Because we do segregate our lives. It's just not something that is now law. Okay? So with that, because the way we segregate our lives, we don't have a shared history. Even though we're living right beside each other, we have different realities. Okay? And so our perception of each other is often skewed. Less and less folks say this, but when I first started this work, people were surprised to see a Black person doing the work that I was doing. Right? Because there was this thought that Black people didn't do that sort of thing. And I usually point to the way Black folks vote. I say, because Black folks, when it comes down to it, we vote for the environment, right? But because we have these sort of separate lives, the messages about each other stays at the forefront. Messages that aren't true. Messages that cause us not to trust each other. It makes it difficult to build relationships between our organizations. Right? So again, we need to be vulnerable. We need to admit that we've segregated our lives. We need to admit that we have made assumptions about each other and have a discussion about it. Talk about, like I do with our students, talk about how we talk about the environment, what vocabulary we use. Right? Have shared discourse. Drop the elitism. I was out with a group of students, and we often ask the students to explain a topic. And this student, I cannot remember what topic it was at the moment. Student was explaining the topic, and then a teacher that was there, science teacher, said, well, that's not what we call it. And she gave the scientific language, right? And so I interrupted. And they said, yes, that is the technical term, but I have a question. Raise your hand if you understood what Rakeem is talking about. And hands went up. Hands of students that had no idea what the thing that Rakeem was describing. Before he described it, they didn't know. Now they understand. So it didn't matter in that moment whether they were using the scientific term. They were educating people in a way that the folks they were talking to understood. So sometimes we have to set aside our biases. We have to set aside our way of thinking. There's only one way. This is the standard. When we do that, when we have shared discourse, when we have vocabulary, when we aren't forcing people to fit into our box, then we can have discussions about what we want the world to look like together. Then we suddenly have shared goals, a shared vision, and a great foundation for our partnership. I hope that you're noticing that as I go through these, each slide is still referring back to systems of oppression. Right? Because scarcity mindset, this feeling that, oh, I don't have time to do that. When I'm talking to community members that are saying that, usually it's because they're struggling to just put food on the table. And the reason they're struggling to put food on the table goes back to systems of oppression. When I talk to organizations that are sort of preservation societies, they say that they don't have capacity to talk about racial issues or environmental justice. They're focused on pristine environments and keeping pristine environments. That's also scarcity mindset, especially given that these pristine environments are linked to urban environments. So working on an issue of environmental justice is not a different thing, is not an add-on. It is integrated. Some folks feel that you need to have influence in order to get stuff done. And the messages about organizations of color is that they're subpar. And so why would we partner with organizations that doesn't have the clout to really get done what we want to get done? That's wasting our time. We need to move faster. That's also scarcity mindset. And it also points to messages about people of color that are not true. The fact that we have to compete for grants seems like an issue, but Blueprint just put in 2 IRA applications, and I did some work on it, but not a lot, because we had teams of people from all different organizations saying, no, we want $4 million, and we want it for the next 5 years. There's 12 organizations. There's government orgs, there's industry, and there's community-based orgs. And we're spreading out these resources. We're not putting in an application, each of us separately. We're putting in one application and we want the money. We've got the data. We've got the expertise, both cultural expertise and technical expertise. We do have people that have a lot of influence. So we know that we can get this done, and we will not separate. We want you to fund us together. We could have a scarcity mindset and say, oh no, if I do that, then I'm not going to get my part. Instead, we said, no, you trust us. Trust that we can do it. Trust that we can work together. And we are armed with data showing how we've worked together in the past. That's how we moved past that scarcity mindset with the coalitions that Blueprint currently has. And we certainly address the feeling that it's a zero-sum situation. That if we work on environmental justice, then we can't work on biodiversity. You know, we can do both. Right? When we do this, when we do the hard work of examining our biases, of cleaning up when we make mistakes, of questioning our scarcity mindset, thinking of ways that we can do this work together, ways we can pool resources, all sorts of resources, ways that we build cultural norms. So we say, this is the culture, this is the team culture we want to have, and this is how everyone's going to behave. This is what's going to happen if anyone makes a mistake. Frees up people so that they know, if I make a mistake, it's going to be okay. So I'm going to engage in this conversation. I'm going to admit that I didn't know that thing. I'm going to admit that I was wrong about that and I'm rethinking it. If I have a challenge, I'm going to say, this is my challenge. And I know that they're not going to think, oh yeah, of course, we shouldn't have invited this person into the coalition. They don't know what they're doing. If I don't have to worry about that stuff, if I relieve myself of that fear, good things happen. It increases team cohesion. Everyone feels like they belong and that they're supported. People are engaged. If I'm struggling with something and I reach out and someone helps, then it increases our efficiency. And all ideas on the table means we come up with innovative solutions. And because I admit I did something wrong, because I admit my mistakes and reflect on them and learn from them, and everyone else is doing that as well, everyone on the team develops individually. It's a lot of work, and it is a lot of self-regulation. I come from the world of engineering, and I will say it, engineering culture breeds perfectionism. Because if you get it wrong, a bridge could fall down, right? And people could die. It could be millions of dollars lost. And so getting it right the first time is really stressed. The problem with that in this situation is it prevents people from engaging. I'm not going to say anything because I might be wrong. Right? When I'm in partnership with others and there's a predictability of inclusive behavior, I can let go of that engineering cultural norm. Yikes. I thought that I was going to fly through this and have like a half hour, and it is 7:58. So I'll go through the slides from our Back 5 partnership a little bit quicker so that we can get to, whoops, not that quick, so that we can get to the Q&A. But here's some insights from our Back 5 partnership out at Leash Botanical Garden. So here are the main partners that started the collaboration. We have Wisdom of the Elders as a Native organization, Leach, of course, the Lent School, Johnson Creek Watershed Council, David Douglas. ICO is the African Immigrant organization, and then Blueprint is for African American folks. And so we came up with shared goals. There was 5 acres that was just all blackberry, and we said, what do we want to do with this space? We want it to be a multicultural space that is an outdoor classroom where people can learn about biodiversity, right? Learn about watershed processes, learn techniques that they can apply in other areas of the city, right? So we want to restore the 5 acres. We want it to be an outdoor classroom and a training ground. And we wanted to welcome any multicultural partnership that wanted to do environmental work and sort of cut their teeth. Come on in, right? Come on in. We've got environmental monitoring that needs to happen. We need to get baseline data on biodiversity, what native plants are here, which aren't, right? We wanted to have lots of workshops to make sure that folks were learning as much as possible about how to keep spaces, how to restore and maintain spaces. There was an area that's sort of a low-lying area that we wanted to install a pond. And of course, we wanted to plant natives and maintain them. So these are outcomes. Just, I only have things here from before the pandemic. This is a presentation we did before everything went haywire. And so I thank my colleague, Joanne from Leach, because she helped with many of these slides. So this is just some of the data. At this time, we had removed 2 acres. We've gone into 2 more acres of the Back 5. And here's some images. So yeah, you see the usual, right? The things that usually take over. And then closer down to Johnson Creek, we have this area. Just this last fall, we planted natives along this area. The site is great because there are places where we can do mindfulness activities. We can talk about fish passage. We brought, there was a bridge that washed out. And so we brought students that were interested in engineering, and I did a module on stream morphology and bridge design. So those are sorts of things that when I say an outdoor classroom, those are the sorts of things that folks were learning out there. This is what it looked like when we got there. It was like, walk this way if you dare, because you're gonna get, your clothes are snagged. by all the blackberry that was out there. These are Wisdom of the Elders folks. And they cleared it using their hand pulling, and they had these huge machines that just sort of ripped out all the blackberry. And then they talked to us about what they were doing. They showed us native plants, and they talked about how those plants are used by the native community for medicinal purposes. They gave us new names for plants. Sometimes the students like the native name for a plant. Sometimes they like the scientific name. And so here is Alvi from Wisdom of the Elders talking about native plants. And then we also have Noah here from Johnson Creek Watershed Council, who is very much on the science, the Western science side. And so Noah speaks in Latin most of the time, right? And so the students picked up, for some native plants, they remember the common name or the name that Alvi said. Sometimes they'll remember the name that Noah said. All I care about is that they remember the name at all and know that it's a native plant, right? Because then we can do things like plant transects and have the students do an inventory of native plants in the area. And then they're off, doing the work, studying, learning, and restoring. And it's a big partnership. So we weren't the only ones out there. Leach has their volunteers that also did plant transects and help. This is what you saw the blackberry from that first image. Here's after they got their hands on it, right? No herbicides. Lots of learning from our government partners as well, coming out to teach the students. Students that were terrified of being outdoors, by the end of it, were picking up critters. Okay. And we got as many people involved as possible. So lots of folks came out to help. We did tool safety training as well. We learned how to propagate native plants. And we built a pond. There's the pond. We wanted this pond to be to dry up in summer. So we wanted it to be ephemeral because we didn't want bullfrogs taking over. And we had our students do lots of journaling. We had them do, and that's including art. So drawing native plants, which forced them to really pay attention to the structure of the plant, so that when they see that plant again in the future, they see it through the eyes of a botanist, the botanist being themselves. Recognizing the different ways leaves develop. Recognizing the difference between, a stem and a petiole. That sort of thing. Because they drew it. So, like I said, many groups went out and did this work. AmeriCorps was out there as well. Some folks that are members of the Native Plant Society were out there as well. I was there looking a little bit, well, I'll leave it alone. I have my mask. This was at the beginning of the pandemic. We did not know what was going on. And so I was like, I'm wearing the safest mask I can find. That was very difficult to have on all day. And so we did lots of weeding, lots of planting. And the youth helped. So once they learned about native plants, then they were the ones doing the plant transects. And everyone had lots of fun doing it. This is Joanne, one of my favorite people. She's no longer at Leach, but she is still working with the Blueprint Foundation. We found lots of little critters in the new pond. And we do lots of surveys, not just plant surveys, but butterfly surveys as well. We did beaver dam mapping, that sort of thing. Or pollinators, we were doing pollinators in that picture. We did mindfulness, and we also did things like the touch game, trying to ID things just by touch, so that the students understand you don't just use your eyes to identify plants.
There is a question that I thought was pretty good
in
the chat. Can you explain what a plant transect, or anytime when you're doing a transect, when you're doing some mapping?
Yeah. So essentially what they do, you can't really count all of the plants in an area, right? You have to take a sample. And so what we do is run a transect or a line along the site. We went upland and towards the floodplain. And then we have these rectangles. And so you put the rectangle down in intervals along that line, right? So maybe it's 10 foot, 20 foot, whatever it is. You put it down, you take an image, and then you count all the native plants, what types of plants are in that rectangle. Take that data, you pick it up, you move it, you do it again, right? To get a sample of the biodiversity that's in the space without having to count every plant. Is that a good description?
Absolutely, yeah. And I love the picture of the guy holding this stinging nettle by the very top, so we won't.
Yes. We took some students out there and we told them about the nettle, and they did not believe us. And so this one student was smacking the nettle on his arm, and boy, was he sorry that he did that. And we also want to make sure that the next generation learns as well. And so we filmed folks on how to do plant transect. We filmed the folks that learned how to do it. Now teach someone else how to do it on camera, so that the next round of folks, we have visuals, a visual training for them. Wisdom to the Elder did their academy out there. Green Workforce Academy also uses this space to learn. Connecting Canopies trainees also uses this space to learn. So welcoming in workforce development programs from all around to do the work. Okay, so some lessons learned. So it's really important to be authentic when we're talking about project goals, but also be open-minded. How do these goals intersect? How does environmental justice goals intersect with diversifying these spaces, right? And being open to adjusting our short and long-term goals. So if we work on this now, this is how it relates to this other thing. And so in the long term, these are the outcomes that we'll see that meet all of the goals that we all care about, right? And so we co-create these goals, and we establish communication plans, right? When do you need to hear from me? What do you need to hear from me about? And what's the best way for me to share that information, right? Are you able to come out weekly? Are you able to come out monthly? There's no judgment. We just want to make sure that we cover our bases here and have enough folks that can get the work done. And then when you show up, again, we're operating under these systems of oppression, which forces us to be intentional, right? And so don't force things. Sometimes we need to step in, sometimes we need to step back. I'll give a very quick story about Joanne. We took students out to do an affinity space and mindfulness activity. Joanne came to unlock the gate and let us in. And because I am, well, I've already told you how much I care about Joanne, I invited her to stay and do the activities with us. And she said, you know, I am honored that you asked, because when we do affinity spaces, it's meant to be just one group, so Black people. And so she said, I'm honored that you asked. I will be back in 2 hours, because we said this was going to be an affinity space. And even though I really want to see what happens and hear what y'all talk about, it's not my business. Y'all need to be out here and do your thing. So I'll be back in a couple hours. So that's the sort of deep allyship. Even though she was curious, she said, this isn't the right time. Right? So supporting affinity, not being ethnocentric, means not seeing the world just through one lens. And noticing and commenting on the good, as well as recognizing when mistakes happen and cleaning up mistakes. Always have to thank the funders. So thank you, funders. And I'll stop there.